3. The lie. One of the most controversial points of Kant's practical philosophy is incontestably the one epitomized in the formula, the right to lie. Kant's position on this issue seems to be, strictly speaking, inhuman. What makes it especially intriguing is the fact that it concerns the very core of his ethics. Kant and the right to lie. In his essay, De Réaction Politique, Benjamin Constant wrote, quote, "The moral principle stating that it is a duty to tell the truth would make any society impossible if that principle were taken singly and unconditionally. We have proof of this in the very direct consequence which a German philosopher has drawn from this principle. This philosopher goes as far as to assert that it would be a crime to tell a lie to a murderer who asked whether our friend, who is pursued by the murderer, had taken refuge in our house." End of quote. Constant's text was translated into German by Professor F. Kramer, who lived in Paris. In the German translation, the passage where Constant speaks of a German philosopher is accompanied by a footnote, in which the translator states that Constant had told him that the German philosopher he had in mind was Kant. What is especially interesting about this is that in Kant's published work, there is no mention of the example referred to by Constant. In spite of this, Kant immediately replied to the German publication of Constant's essay with an article of his own on a supposed right to lie because of philanthropic concerns. After quoting Constant, the passage above, Kant adds a footnote to the effect that he remembers stating what Constant suggests somewhere, but does not remember where. The whole affair is quite amusing, because Kant recognizes himself in something which he, at least in these particular words, never actually wrote. This, of course, becomes irrelevant the moment Kant takes this position as his own and attempts to defend it. He claims that even in this particular case, it would be wrong to lie. If there is no other way out, we must tell the murderer who is after our friend the truth. It is probably not necessary to point out that Kant's position in this case did not meet with approval on the part of his critics. On the contrary, it still remains the most abhorred part of his philosophy. Among those who consider it an ethical issue, it is clearly an object of loathing and rejection. Herbert J. Payton, for instance, takes this mistaken essay as illustrating the way in which an old man, Kant was 73 when he wrote it, can push his central conviction to an unjustified extremes under the influence of his early training, namely Kant's mother, who supposedly servilely condemned lying. Payton suggests that we dismiss this essay as a temporary aberration, which has no impact on the basic principles of Kantian ethics. There have also been some attempts to save Kant by shifting the issue from moral to political philosophy and to the philosophy of law. This reading is not without justification. Kant does, in fact, say in a footnote, "I don't want to sharpen this principle to the point of saying, untruthfulness is a violation of one's duty to himself. For this principle belongs to ethics, but here the concern is with a duty of right, Rechtsplicht." However, we must not forget, first of all, that Kant's answer would have been no different had he treated the question as an ethical one. And, secondly, that in his argument, Kant himself often moves far beyond a purely juridical or legal ground and off into ethical waters. We might claim that this ambiguity has its origins in Constant's essay itself, which begins with the question of a certain moral principle, but then elaborates the argument in terms of legal rights and duties. Kant does enter into the debate on this level, but the question of moral principle always lingers in the background. Again, it must be emphasized that it is above all the ethical side of the example led at Kant's door by Constant that has provoked the most indignation and discomfort. This is why attempts to save Kant by shifting the issue from moral to political and legal philosophy are somehow problematic. Such readings suggest, at least implicitly, that Kant would have replied altogether differently had he considered the problem as an ethical problem. In other words, this reading does not resolve the problem and the discomfort that Kant's position generates. It merely sidesteps it by shifting our attention to something else. Be this as it may, we will examine both aspects of these arguments, the legal and the ethical. As we will try to show, Kant's appeal to the legal perspective is weak, while the least we can say about the ethical aspect of the controversy is that Kant remains loyal to the basic principles of his moral philosophy. If we begin by comparing the 8th chapter of Constant's text, Des Principes, with Kant's reply, we get the impression that both authors are fighting against imaginary adversaries. As a matter of fact, the principal addressee of Constant's critique is not Kant, but those who would like to reject principles in the name of common sense, which has for Constant the same meaning as prejudice. Constant's text must be viewed in the context of the French Revolution and of the relation between the principles of 1789 and the devastating consequences in 1793. Its starting point is what was considered at the time the extreme discord between the principles of the revolution and their application in practice. This discord gave rise to a popular revolt against principles. Lofty principles were considered responsible for all the evils of the terror. Or, in another version of this view, they were good in theory, but had no practical value. Constant offers a defense of these principles, and, in his terms, strives towards their rehabilitation. The way he goes about this task often evokes Kant's own argument developed in his text from 1793 on the proverb that may be true in theory but is no practical use. He claims that if a principle is bad, it is not because it is too theoretical, but because it is not theoretical enough. For this reason, Constant introduces the concept of a middle principle, which would allow more precision in the application of general principles to particular cases. According to Constant, Kant lacks just such a principle. In the case of the murderer pursuing our friend, the middle principle is to be deduced as follows. Quote, "It is a duty to tell the truth. The concept of duty is inseparable from the concept of right. A duty is what in one man corresponds to the right of another. Where there are no rights, there are no duties. To tell the truth is thus a duty, but it is a duty only with regard to one who has a right to the truth. But no one has a right to a truth that harms others." End of quote. This also sums up Constant's basic argument against Kant, or the German philosopher, for whom moral principles have an absolute value. Constant claims that it was precisely this kind of absolutism that turned general opinion against principles as such. Before examining Kant's answer, we should stress that Kant accepts Constant's challenge in its most rigorous form. That is to say, he accepts the assumption that we can answer the murderer who is pursuing our friend only with a yes or a no, and that we cannot simply refuse to answer the question. In these circumstances, says Kant, it is our duty to tell the truth. The first question that arises here is, to what extent are truthfulness and lying legal ideas? Even though the blame may be laid on Constant for initiating this confusion, Kant seems to do his best to sustain it. In spite of his decision to treat the pair of terms, truthfulness and lying, in a legal context, his argumentation continually veers off in other directions, sometimes in the direction of ethical issues, for instance, when he says that the duty to tell the truth is a sacred and unconditionally commanding law of reason, sometimes towards more philosophical terrain, in the sense of being concerned not so much with the law itself as with a certain philosophy of law. It may be true that these latter two are more or less indissociable in Kant's theory, yet it is still helpful to insist upon the difference between the law as existing practice, instituted in particular state apparatuses, and the philosophy of law, which is concerned with the foundations and possibility of law. It is in fact this distinction which underlies some claims that Kant is compelled to add to his arguments. For instance, a lie does not require the additional condition that it must do harm to another, as jurists require in their definition. Kant takes issue with Constant's argument on 2 points. The first concerns the very concept of a lie and the link between cause and effect that follows from it. Kant first points out that truth does not depend on the will. In other words, we have to distinguish between the truthfulness, the intention, the will to tell the truth, and the truth or falsity of a statement. The first case has to do with the agreement between our statements and our beliefs, while the second case, the accent is on the relation between our statements and the facts to which they refer. The same holds for the lie. In order to illustrate this distinction, Kant modifies Constant's example somewhat. In Kant's version, it might happen that I tell a lie by saying that the intended victim is not in the house, but because the latter has actually, though unbeknownst to me, escaped through the window, he is met outside by the murderer and killed. This version of the scenario shows that the liar might be mistaken about the truth. If we want to deceive another, the intention to do so is not sufficient. In other words, and this is what Kant is getting at, there is no necessary connection between my answer to the murderer's question and his subsequent actions. Thus, if I tell the truth, I cannot be held responsible for my friend's death. This is not only because I cannot know with absolute certainty where my friend is at the moment I am speaking, but also because I have no means of knowing how the murderer will take my answer of yes or no, whether he will believe me, or whether he will assume that I am attempting to protect my friend by lying. Once again, there is no necessary relation between my answer and the act of murder. I can end up revealing my friend's whereabouts, even though I have the best of intentions to keep him concealed. If we consider only the logical side of things, Kant is, of course, right. But the problem is that the law deals mostly with cases where the link between cause and effect is not a necessary one, because an event, X, becomes necessary only when it has actually taken place. Until the last moment, there is always the possibility that it will not occur. For this reason, the law can reasonably use the concepts of strong and weak probability. Thus, we may conclude that in terms of the legal aspect of the question, Kant's argument is not very persuasive. Kant does, however, develop another argument against Constant, related to his philosophy of law. According to Kant's conception of law, Recht, truth and lying affects the very foundations of law and of society as such, because legality and the rule of law are founded upon a contract. But there can be no such thing as a contract without some fundamental truthfulness. A contract makes sense only if the partners involved in it take it seriously. The contract, the social contract in this case, is that which enables us to enjoy a certain basic security, and thus a civilized life. So it serves as the basis for all other duties and legal rights. It is owing to this view that questions of truthfulness and lying have, according to Kant, such weight in the socio-juridical context. They concern the very foundations of society and law. Hence, the lie exceeds the narrow frame imposed on it by positive legal considerations. In terms of the latter, the lie becomes legally relevant only if its effects harm another person, and if this harm can be specified. This is why Kant finds it necessary to add, quote, "Hence a lie defined merely as an intentionally untruthful declaration to another man does not require the additional condition that it must do harm to another, as jurists require in their definition. For a lie always harms another. If not some other human being, then it nevertheless does harm to humanity in general, inasmuch as it vitiates the very source of law." End of quote. This is precisely the point stressed by commentators who defend Kant on this issue. Julius Ebbinghaus, for instance, says, "Whereas the murderer's maxim destroys the legal security of life, the liar's maxim goes much further, for it deprives any possible security, be it the security of life or something else, of the character of a legitimate demand, i.e., of a right." In other words, whereas the murderer violates a particular law, the liar makes law as such impossible, since he annihilates the foundation of any contract, and hence of society as such. However much more comprehensible this explication, with its evocation of Kant's conceptualization of the social contract, may render Kant's position, it does not, nevertheless, make it any more convincing. To put the problem simply, the law is there precisely so that we do not need to rely upon the truthfulness of others. It is very easy to sign a contract without having the slightest intention of respecting it. The purely symbolic gesture of signing the contract is what binds us to it, not our authentic conviction to abide by it. That is, violation of contracts results in legal penalties. The whole reason for the law and its attendant rights is to provide a more solid basis for contracts than the mere truthfulness of others. The lie would be the ultimate crime only if real social relations were in fact grounded in the truthfulness of others. Given the existence of the law, however, a lie is just one of many possible violations of legal norms, not something that would undermine the very possibility of the law, and would therefore have much more disastrous consequences than murder. The third, and most powerful, argument that Kant develops against Constant still remains to be considered. This argument is best expressed in the following three passages. Quote, "Truthfulness is a duty that must be regarded as the basis of all duties founded on contract, and the laws of such duties would be rendered uncertain and useless if even the slightest exception to them were admitted. The man who asks permission to think first about possible exceptions to the rule is already a liar in potentia. This is because he shows that he does not acknowledge truthfulness as in itself a duty, but reserves for himself exceptions from a rule, which by its very nature does not admit of any exceptions, inasmuch as to admit of such would be self-contradictory. All practical principles of right must contain rigorous truth, and the principles that are here called middle principles can contain only the closer determination of the application of these latter principles, according to rules of politics, to cases that happen to occur. But such middle principles can never contain exceptions to the aforementioned principles of right. This is because such exceptions would destroy the universality on account of which alone they bear the name of principles." End of quotes. We can see in these passages that Kant introduces a new element to his argument, the question of the exception. Since all these passages contain responses to Constant's conception of the middle principle, let us once again recall Constant's argument. Quote, "It is a duty to tell the truth. The concept of duty is inseparable from the concept of right. A duty is what in one man corresponds to the right of another. Where there are no rights, there are no duties. To tell the truth is thus a duty, but it is a duty only with regard to one who has a right to tell the truth. But no one has a right to a truth that harms others." End of quote. This passage can be read in two different ways. As will become clear in a moment, the first of this, the one chosen by Kant, does not have much basis in Constant's text. Kant holds that Constant's reasoning is an attempt to make a rule, a principle, out of the very exception to the rule. According to Kant, Constant's concept of the middle principle implies that the violation of a norm can, in certain circumstances, itself become a norm, which would make the very concept of violation of duty absurd, since this violation would then have to be seen as imposed by duty itself. Kant is not, however, the only one to read Constant in this way. In his commentary on the Kant-Constant controversy, Peyton, for example, speaks throughout of exceptions to rules and to the categorical imperative. If this were in fact Constant's position, then Kant would have every reason to attack it. It is in fact possible to show that Kant imputes to Constant something which the latter does not maintain, and that he is thus fighting against an imaginary adversary. In spite of this, however, Kant's argument remains perfectly valid in itself. It bears examination, especially because critics of Kant have often defended Constant against Kant with precisely this Constant the one presumed to propagate exceptions to rules. Indeed, if Constant's middle principle involved exceptions to general principles, the concept of a principle as such would be deprived of all sense. The violation of the law can never, however exceptional the circumstances, become a rule or a principle. And this is precisely what would happen if we were to formulate an exception to a rule in terms of a middle principle. We have already pointed out that from the moment the law exists, the lie cannot be considered a supreme crime, one that undermines the very possibility of the law, but has to be seen as just one violation among others. What would, however, count as the supreme crime would be to ratify the lie, to formulate something like a right to lie. The supreme crime would be to write into a law the stipulation that, in certain circumstances, it can be violated. As a matter of fact, there is an important difference between the two statements. 1. In certain circumstances, it is permissible to violate the law. 2. There are cases where the law does not come into force. Consequently, it cannot be violated in such cases. If matters are not yet sufficiently clear, they may become so if we take into consideration the other possible reading of Constant's argument. First of all, it should be stressed that Constant never uses the term exception and never speaks of exceptions to the rules or of the right to lie. He never says that in this particular case, that of the murderer pursuing our friend, we have the right to violate the general norm, which requires that we tell the truth. On the contrary, what he says is that if we lie in such a situations, we do not in fact go against any juridical norm or duty. Where there are no rights, there are no duties. In order to understand the point of Constant's argument, we would do well briefly to consider the legal status of the so-called case of necessity. This is often described as a logical and juridical paradox, since it involves a kind of legitimate violation of the law. Say I kill somebody in self-defense. If we describe this as a violation permitted or even prescribed by the law, we have a paradox. The paradox disappears, however, the moment we realize that the case of necessity is not an instance of the law. In short, in such a case, the judge would declare that no law has been violated, not that I was legally justified in violating the law. And this is what Constant is getting at. Constant is not, as Kant and many others maintain, saying that the murderer's violation of the law legitimizes my own violation of the law, in the given case, my lying. He tries instead to show that in this case there is no violation of the law at all. We can thus conclude this discussion about the legal aspect of the lie by granting that Constant's arguments are indeed more plausible than Kant allows. In this debate, we might even say, Kant himself violates one of the fundamental principles of his practical philosophy, the principle that compels us to distinguish the ethical domain from the legal. This distinction, however, must be maintained if we are to reach the point where Kant's insistence on the unconditional character of duty acquires its rightful value.